Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anupma, Professor at Department of Economics, Punjabi University, Patiala. I am here talking to you on behalf of Dr. Flinder Kumar Sudan, Professor, Department of Economics, University of Jammu. I am going to talk about the module Climate-related disasters and displacement from Demography of Climate Adaptation. So students, we are going to discuss about climate change, its impacts and the policy initiatives from human rights perspective, especially where the displacement of population is concerned. The climate change will lead to mass displacement in future. However, no one is able to tell how large will be the scale of this eventual displacement. It is estimated that 150 to 200 million people are displaced by climate change. At the same time, it is most commonly claimed that about 1 billion lose their homes, lands, and their financial assets due to climate events. Several prominent non-governmental organizations have predicted that in worst scenarios, several million experience forced climate migration. It is clear that displacement caused by climate change will have severe and long-lasting repercussions on human rights, security, and the land use. Hence, this module aims to know about climate change and human rights approach, to examine International Human Rights Legal Code, to discuss normative framework protecting human rights, to estimate the housing needs of climate change forced migrants, to find solutions for climate-induced displacement. Climate change and human rights approach. In the context of climate change, a human rights approach is required rather than a purely humanitarian or other approach. There is need of robust laws and policies to ensure houses for the lost houses and land for the lost land. Anything short of that will short in the human rights litmus test. The forced climate displacement is considered as a human rights issue. With the international human rights regime, the principle of inherent dignity of the human person forces us to take a more caring, practical, and concrete perspective on the measures required to adapt to the displacement caused by the climate change. The human rights approach to climate displacement implies that each and every single person who is forced from his or her home, land, or property must have a remedy available with respects, protects, and if necessary, fulfills his or her right as identified under international human rights law. The climate justice calls for ensuring the climate displaced persons a home for a home and a land for land. This is the essential message needed to be sent to all states, all intergovernmental organizations, and all people worldwide. It is fortunate that human rights dimensions of climate change are receiving greater attention today. The United Nations Human Rights Council has conducted several studies on the issue. The governments who are experiencing greatest impact of climate change, in particular Kiribati, the Maldives, and Tuvalu, have raised the human rights elements of climate change to the higher echelons of international policymaking. A growing number of civil society groups are playing even more direct roles within the context of climate change in a myriad of ways. The climate change is expected to affect the whole spectrum of civil, cultural, economic, political, and social rights, including the right to life, the right to water, the right to freedom of expression, the right to health, the right to food, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to critical participation, the right to information, the right to be free from discrimination, the right to equal treatment, the right to security of the person, and a host of other rights. These rights should have a direct bearing on a broad cross-section of climate change decisions made by the governments, which in turn will determine the consequences of these decisions and how the impact of climate change will be experienced by individual right holders. International Human Rights Legal Code. If the focus is exclusively on the displacement dimensions of climate change, there are a range of rights within the International Human Rights Legal Code. These are particularly relevant to the discussion of climate change-induced displacement and are far more extensive than is usually assumed. These include the right to adequate housing and rights in housing, the right to security of tenure, the right to be arbitrarily evicted, the right of land and rights in land, the right of property and peaceful enjoyment of possessions, the right to privacy and respect for home, the right to security of person, the right to housing, land and property, that is HLP, restitution, compensation following forced displacement, the right to freedom to movement and choose one's residence. If we take together all of the entitlements and obligations which are inherent within this bundle of HLP rights, it becomes evident that people everywhere are meant to be able to live safely and securely on a piece of land, to reside in an adequate and affordable home with access to all basic services, and to feel safe so that these life attributes will be fully respected, protected, and fulfilled. Normative framework protecting human rights. The normative framework which is protecting these rights is significant. It is constantly evolving and over-expanding, mixing the sentiments of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and a range of other treaties, together with a vast array of equally important instruments and imperative standards, such as United Nations Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, the right to adequate housing, the right to water, and the right of internally displaced persons, the principles on housing and property restitution for refugees and displaced persons, and many others will lead to robust international human rights laws and standards. The governments can use this to establish the legal, policy and institutional frameworks needed to ensure that any rights related to climate change will be upheld, particularly those involving durable solutions to displacement. In the context of human rights laws, there is a particularly strong base to demand positive and well-planned actions by states and others to develop the means required to protect and secure all of these rights for climate displaced persons. Nonetheless, when the performance of states and the international community over the past 60 years of the human rights experiment is taken into account, the performance is not satisfactory. The hundreds of millions of rights holders around the globe are denied their legitimate HLP rights. Solving the HLP consequences of climate change is not a simple task. Indeed, the prospects of achieving this are truly daunting. It will require leadership, commitment, and creativity on the part of the states. The climate adaptation and human rights must converge to build a stronger and more vibrant response to impacts of climate change. Housing needs of climate change forced migrants. The population of 191 nations of the world already faces a severe, massive, and dramatic global housing crisis. More than 1 billion people, that is, 1 in every 6 human beings, spend their lives in one of the more than 2 lakh slums across the world. If the predictions made recently hold true, 2 billion or more slum dwellers can be expected by 2030. This crisis further adds difficulties for the displacement due to climate change. The governments are already legally bound to provide access to sufficient and affordable housing for everyone. However, the governments often failed in achieving these objectives. The ordinary citizens in Egypt, India, Botswana, Delhi, Belgrade, Detroit, and elsewhere are increasingly less likely to be able to afford safe, secure, and decent homes in accordance with their rights. These situations will not suddenly improve for climate change forced migrants due to the nature of their displacement. The mass of human race have experienced forced displacement in past decades caused by conflict, investor greed, poorly planned development, disasters, earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis. More people have lost their homes and lands due to these events. Moreover, very few experience their rights respected. There is a slow and gradual improvement in their housing and living conditions once the circumstances leading to their displacement have ended or been altered. Therefore, human rights-based strategies are needed to deal with the displacement dimension of climate change. However, whether as a consequence of dam displacement in China, conflict displacement in Sri Lanka, Iraq, or Bosnia, discriminatory displacement by Israel, or tsunami displacement in Aceh, most nations' track record in treating victims of displacement as right holders, in particular HLP right holders, is very poor. There exist some positive highlights. For example, the increasing acknowledgement of the right of refugees and displaced persons to return to their original homes. There is realization by the international agencies that displacement should be a policy option rather than the first one. On the whole, the situation and the perspectives taken by the government and the powerful actors remain alarming. It constitutes another grey barrier which must be considered in developing right-based responses to the displacement caused by climate change. Now it is interesting to discuss about solutions for climate-induced displacement. The human rights dimension of climate change have been increasingly identified and, to a very small degree, acted upon. However, what has not still occurred is the development of detailed, well-sourced, and concerted efforts to find sustainable, right-based solutions to all types of displacement, including those caused by climate change. What are the real HLP options for those who are forcibly displaced by climate change in the coming years? Can an effective right-based response to climate change-induced displacement be encouraged so that it generates solutions to the emerging crisis? The answer to the latter question is a strong yes. However, in order to develop such responses, it should be kept in mind that not all types of displacement caused by climate change will necessarily have the same consequences. In fact, there are at least 5 different types of climate-induced displacement, each of which require different remedies. Generally speaking, climate change induced displacement is likely to manifest 5 primary ways. Number 1, temporary displacement. The populations who generally move for short periods of time are temporarily displaced due to climate events such as a hurricane, flood, storm surge, or tsunami, and are able to return to their homes once the event has ceased. The second type is that of permanent local displacement. The populations who are displaced locally but on a permanent basis because of irreversible changes to their living environment, especially sea level rise, coastal floods, and the lack of clean water, and increasingly recurrent storm surges, are called permanent local displaced. This form of displacement implies that localized displacement solutions will be available to this group of forced migrants, such as providing higher ground in the same locality. The third one is that of permanent internal displacement. The populations who are displaced within their nation's boundary but adequately far away from their places of original residence so that the return is unlikely or impossible are called permanent internally displaced. This would involve a family displaced from one region of a country to another region in the country. For instance, from a coastline to an inland town or city. Number 4, permanent regional displacement. The populations for whom the displacement solutions lie within their own countries are non-existent or inaccessible and who migrate to nearby countries willing to offer permanent protection. This would include, for instance, a citizen of Vanuatu or Kiribati migrating on a permanent basis to New Zealand. Number 5, permanent intercontinental displacement. The populations for whom no national or regional displacement solutions are available and who are able to receive the protection of another state on another continent, such as Maldivian who migrates to London. All of these 5 categories, however, have different policy and legal implications for the governments. The international agencies are tasked with assisting climate change forced migrants to find long-lasting solutions to their plight. Such responses, which can probably be the most useful to understand in terms of short and long-term options, have very important ramifications for those affected and for those involved in ameliorating the displacement crisis caused by the climate change. Of course, the short-term policy responses would be same as those already existed following many conflicts and disasters and would consist largely of shelter programs, forced migrant camps and settlements, and other short-term measures. These in turn would require to be amplified by local adaptation measures that prevent similar displacement in the future. For example, by raising the floor levels of homes, etc. The long-term policy responses would be grounded more widely within the framework of HLP rights. It would involve remedies such as provision of alternative homes and lands, compensation and access to new livelihoods, among other policy measures. It should be based on the lessons learned from previous efforts at permanent settlement. The record of treatment faced by those who have arguably already been displaced due to climate change does not bode particularly well for the millions yet to be displaced. It is frequently reiterated that it is not the poor who are the first to migrate from situations of crisis. Rather, the poor are most likely to be most vulnerable victims of climate displacement. Given their frequent inability to migrate in the event, this becomes necessary due to the financial and other constraints they may experience. The poor are always the ones left behind. Will this be allowed to happen again in the context of climate change? The most renowned cases of climate change induced displacements are the Carteret and other atolls, for example Tasman, Motlog and Nigeria in Papua New Guinea, Latu village in Vanuatu, Shishmere and other villages in Alaska, that is United States, and Lohachara Island in Hooghly River in India. All of these have not been very successful in resetting those displaced. Thus, all instances of violations of human rights are obviously not subject to full compliance. The consequences faced by those already displaced due to climate change are profound. The resources are truly lacking. The governmental and international agency responses have been remarkably weak. There has been greater emphasis on the displacement dimension of climate change and the solutions required to address it. Some of the solutions are truly extraordinary, focusing on financial, political solidarity, and moral aspects. To begin with, it must be kept in mind that the costs related with involuntary resettlement in development contexts are very high and equally resource intensive. The resettlement efforts have often failed over the past decades, and the situation is likely to be even worse in the context of climate change. In given scenarios, the pertinent questions are: what can be done to improve the human rights prospects of those affected by climate change? What specific areas of concern demand greater attention by citizens, states, and the international community? Keeping in view these questions, the following 4 areas require special attention in order to build the capacity of better address of the human rights implications of climate change. Now we can also discuss about adequate domestic institutional frameworks. In the context of climate change, the rights of displaced needs to be addressed adequately. It is necessary to clarify which public institutions are legal to resolve their plight within the affected countries. In order to ascertain this, forced migrants can reasonably be expected to ask some very straightforward questions. These are: where do I turn for assistance? On which door do I knock for relief and remedy? What rights do I have to a new home or new land? How long will I be homeless? What laws and rules are in place to ensure the enforcement of my rights? Am I entitled to compensation or operations? Very few countries are, to be bluntly speaking, none can answer these or related questions easily, adequately, and quickly. This is not to condemn, but rather to simply point out that good planning, good institutional frameworks, good laws, and good policies are all required for successful adaptation to current and future climate change challenges. Human rights laws and growing numbers of judicial decisions on HLP rights are necessary. The adherence to the most important human rights treaties, laws, and principles oblige states to plan aptly. Human rights laws need states not only to plan but to carefully identify domestic human rights challenges in order to develop laws and policies sufficient to deal with these and to make sure that remedy of many sorts are available to individuals and communities. Adequate international institutional frameworks. There is a lack of specific international institutional framework to protect the rights of climate displaced persons. How to ensure that forced migrants no longer fall through the cracks of the international protection and humanitarian regimes. Many have proposed that the 1951 UN Refugees Convention and its 1967 protocol should be structurally revised in order to expand the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, that is UNHCR, mandate to include assistance to and protection of climate displaced populations. However, expanding the coverage offered within the Refugees Convention is far from assured. Moreover, there is significant reluctance both within UNHCR and especially from the donors that support it to make the giant institutional leap towards providing structural assistance to climate displaced populations. At the same time, would it truly be wiser to attempt to build a new global institution to be in charge of climate migrants and to bear responsibility for the huge and long-term tasks associated with protecting the basic rights of climate-based persons? If the answer is no, the time has rather come for states and UNHCR to start systematically to analyze the implications of incorporating these issues into both their legal mandates and their day-to-day operations. For this, UNHCR would certainly work closely with states, other United Nations and international organizations, and with NGOs and the migrants themselves for finding solutions that are grounded profoundly in the spirit and letter of human rights. Facilitating the evolution of international law. Another important step that is worth pursuing is the development of a comprehensive international standard on the rights of climate displaced persons. Many latest initiatives have made significant contributions to the thinking needed to adopt a new standard. The declaration of the 14th SARC summit called for adaptation initiatives and programs, cooperation and early forecasting, warning and monitoring, and sharing of knowledge on the impacts of climate change in order to pursue climate resilient development in South Asia. The Malé Declaration on Human Dimension of Global Climate Change, adopted on 14th November 2007, made frequent reference to human rights principles, including the fundamental right to an environment capable of supporting human society and the full enjoyment of human rights. This declaration urges participants at the Bali Conference of the Parties of UN Framework Convention on Climate Change to pay greater attention to the human dimension of climate change. It also seeks the increased engagement of UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on climate change issues. Addressing the land challenge. Finally, the governments throughout the world should be encouraged to review public land holdings and domestic legislation as they relate to questions of expropriation of land for public purposes. It is widely agreed that climate change-induced displacement, among other things, will put immense pressure on cities and the slums that surround them. Indeed, without appropriate adaptation measures, the word's slum will grow at a faster rate and in turn create health, social, economic, and other crises. To assist in reducing these pressures, governments everywhere should begin identifying unused land for possible future use to resettle people and their communities. So students, let us sum up what we have learned from this module. To summarize, when people are endangered with the loss of their homes, lands, and properties due to climate change, there is a need to be realistic and to acknowledge that this is not solely about circumstances such as those facing the Maldives Kiribati, Tuvalu, and some other island states. Certainly, only a small portion of expected displacement in future will take place in small island states. And even here, possibly less than 1 million people will need permanent regional or intercontinental resettlement. This is a tragedy for all of those islanders who lose their homes, but it is a tragedy of a scale that can be managed sustainably and within a human right framework. In the context of small island nations, what is unique and particularly tragic is the unimaginable prospect not only of displacement on a massive scale, but the probability that whole nations may become completely unable of sustaining populations. In some terrible cases, some island nations have ultimately ceased to exist together. This is certainly one of humankind's greatest tragedies. This challenge can most effectively be addressed through use of the power of human rights to housing, land, and property in all countries affected by climate change. That's all with today's lecture. I hope you must have enjoyed it. Thank you.